Chapter 14. The Earth Before They Left. The number of people in the hospital was manageable. When Laura and Elspeth arrived and stepped hand in hand through the large entrance door, there were about 15 people in the waiting area. In one corner of the waiting room sat a father with a small girl, Elspeth's age. He had her on his lap, played with her, and whispered calming words into her ear. With a stab in her heart, Laura had to think of Jared. "The room in which you spent the night of the storm with Jared is still free," Jane said, and tore her out of her thoughts. "I kept it for you. However, this time there are 3 beds in it." She held out a small key to Laura. "I thought that Jared would be also among the travelers," she added, almost sheepishly. "The transfer flight to French Guiana will take place in 2 weeks. Laura thanked her and went with Elspeth to the room she already knew from her last visit. The next day, the hospital began to fill with new arrivals. They came in inflatable boats, makeshift but functional rafts, and sometimes also in sailboats like Jane. Many of them were picked up by her and driven to the hospital, like Elspeth and Laura. There were all kinds of people among them, old and young people, men and women, and all different ethnicities. Elspeth got to know a girl, Joel. Laura estimated her to be perhaps 10 years old. She was traveling alone, and Laura offered her the empty bed in their room, which she accepted gratefully. "Where are your parents?" Laura asked her, but she only shook her head and avoided eye contact. Many of them were traumatized, and Laura asked no more questions. Even though many of the passengers brought provisions with them, the supplies were scarce, and the portions were correspondingly small. They went to bed hungry in the evening. The lower floor of the hospital was now packed with people. The few free rooms were fully occupied, and the corridors, the waiting area, and the other rooms were sleeping camps with suitcases, bags, sleeping bags, and rows of sleeping, sitting, and lying people. There were only narrow passages through which one could reach the kitchen, the bathrooms, and the exits, and almost constantly a quiet murmur went through the room. The later it became, the quieter it grew, until the murmuring completely died down and turned into a soft snoring. Luckily it was the last evening before departure, Laura thought, as she looked down the corridor in the evening and saw the many people. She went back into the narrow room, without a window, and quietly closed the door, a luxury that very few here otherwise had, and for which she was very grateful. As she lay in the narrow hospital bed, Elspeth and Joel already asleep, her thoughts painfully drifted back to the last evening with Jared. She stared at the ceiling, and a warm tingling ran through her body as she thought of his touch. He was probably sitting by the campfire with Boyle right now, eating freshly caught fish. She quickly chased the thought away and turned onto her side. She had to stay with herself now, here in this moment, and focus on what lay ahead of her. Tomorrow morning her journey into a new life would begin. Jane was the first to wake up and began waking the people in the hospital. "In 2 hours the transfer ship will arrive. Please get ready, everyone. Keep your belongings and your tickets ready." Movement went through the previously quiet crowd, and a murmur awoke and began to swell in the reception hall. Jane knocked on the door of Laura, who was already awake. She called out again, "Please remain in the entrance hall until you are instructed to go outside and show your ticket." But when the big ship came closer and docked at the pier in front of the hospital, the people streamed out of the entrance hall onto the pier, and no one listened anymore. A large staircase extended from the ship's hull and led down onto the pier. Then a formation of men and women armed with machine guns and wearing protective vests stepped out. Always 2 side by side, they disembarked from the ship and lined up along the pier, to the right and left, so that one had to pass them in order to get onto the ship. The crowd of people who had just been eagerly leaving the hospital now came to an abrupt stop as the soldiers began to move towards them and push them back. They all had a sun printed on their black uniforms, on the protective vests and the sleeves, a star. Laura watched everything from inside and kept Elspeth and Joel close to her. Every time she thought those were the last 2 soldiers leaving the ship, 2 more appeared, walking along the pier and joining the other soldiers. In the end, and after what felt like an eternity, the last 2 soldiers positioned themselves at the entrance of the hospital. The impatient crowd had been pushed back into the foyer again. Jane walked up to the 2 soldiers at the entrance, shook both of their hands, and exchanged a brief word with them. Then she nodded and turned back towards the masses of people in the hospital. "Please line up in a single row and have your tickets ready." The people murmured among themselves and began to squeeze into a long line. "We can sit down again," Laura said to Elspeth and Joel. "This is going to take a while." The armed man at the entrance door of the hall meticulously checked the tickets and took a mouth swab of everyone, presumably to check the passengers once more for illnesses. One by one, the people went out onto the pier past the soldiers and disappeared into the hull of the ship. "She has to come with me." A man who was next in line shouted at the soldiers, "I'm not going without my wife." "No ticket, no entry," said the soldier on the left, and they positioned themselves with a wide stance in front of the man and his wife. The woman was crying. "I'm not going without my wife," the man repeated and looked at the soldiers suspiciously. "Move aside," the soldier to the right shouted and shoved him to the side with his rifle. The man fell to the ground and his wife sobbed loudly. "You can't just let the people die here," the man shouted and threw himself at the soldier, trying to tear the rifle from their hands. In the brief struggle, a shot went off, hitting another man in the crowd. People began to scream, and some started to run away back into the hospital. The wounded man lay on the ground, writhing and whimpering, holding his side. Laura pulled Elspeth and Joel closer to her and wrapped her arms protectively around them. The man who had attacked the soldier was still fighting. He had taken a blow to the head, blood ran from his temple into his eye. His wife had sunk to the ground onto her knees and was crying bitterly. "Enough," she sobbed. "You're going to get yourself killed." Her husband no longer seemed to hear her. Enraged, he fought the soldier when 2 more entered the hospital, brought him to the ground, restrained him, and aimed their weapons at him. The man's ticket lay on the floor, and the soldier he had struggled with slowly picked it up and tore it apart in front of everyone's eyes. "Then you're not coming either," he said with a bitter grin. "Tie him up," he ordered, and the soldiers dragged the screaming, thrashing man to a radiator in the corner, where they chained him to it with handcuffs. The soldier went over to his wife, dragged her to the radiator as well. "Then you'll both rot here." Then the soldiers returned to formation, and the armed man raised his voice. "Anyone who thinks they have a chance of coming along without a ticket is mistaken. The next person who delays the mission like this will be shot. We have no time for these games. We have a time window, and we have limited space. Anyone who resists from now on will be eliminated." Some people broke down in tears, sobbing and murmuring once again swept through the hospital reception hall. Eventually the line at the exit formed again, and this time it moved more quickly. Laura waited until the line grew shorter. There were several people sitting on chairs and waiting, like Laura. In the end, about 15 people were still sitting in the waiting area, and only 2 people remained in line. Laura looked around and met the eyes of the people still sitting there, one by one. A mother with 2 small children met her gaze and slowly shook her head. Laura understood that they too had no valid tickets and hoped somehow to come along. Her stomach tightened painfully and she looked away. There is limited space, Laura thought, but now, after they destroyed the man's ticket, there was theoretical 1 more space. She stood up and went with Elspeth and Joel towards the soldiers. "Do you have your ticket?" she asked Joel, and she pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her jacket pocket. When they reached the exit, Laura showed her lottery ticket and then Elspeth's. They let the swab taken and were examined, just like the others. Then the soldier blocking their path stepped aside and cleared the way. The evening sun glittered golden on the water, and Laura and Elspeth walked through the corridor of soldiers towards the entrance of the ship. Joel followed right behind them. When they arrived at the entrance, a soldier gave them an envelope. "This is your room number and other instructions. Welcome aboard," he said with a smile. She smiled back, but her smile did not reach her eyes. Laura suddenly noticed how agitated she was. The travel time to the airport was supposed to take 2 weeks. There were only a few usable airports left in the world, located high enough to escape the masses of water. The rooms on the ship were shared in small groups. Laura, Elspeth, and Joel were to share a room. Many of the people initially gathered in the reception hall of the ship, but when they began to read the instructions in the envelope, they slowly started heading towards their rooms. When Laura reached the reception hall, she looked around in astonishment for a while and absorbed the impressions. A large golden star spread across the entire floor of the hall. The same star the soldiers wore on their uniforms, and the same star that was stamped on the bottom edge of the letter she had received at the entrance of the ship. The ship was white and modern on the inside. It did not suit them. She felt like a foreign body in this clean and beautiful-looking environment. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her hair frizzy and disheveled. All of them looked so worn down. Laura looked at her scratched hands, then took Elspeth by one hand and Joel by the other and set off to find their room. She held the card up to the lock on the door. She remembered that as a child she had once stayed in a hotel with her parents that looked a bit like this. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped inside. In front of her was a short hallway with a mirror at the wall. When she walked in, she saw a room with a large double bed with white pillows and blankets, a nightstand with a small lamp, a small desk with a chair. The room had a small balcony and a separated area where 2 single beds stood. Laura did not know when she had last seen a room like this. She moved slowly towards the bed and sat down carefully on the edge of it. The bed was so soft. In that moment she could have cried with happiness, laughed, but she felt weirdly empty and numb. Elspeth and Joel ran to their room and exclaimed, "Wow!" They looked at each other and began to laugh and shout, ran squealing to their beds and climbed onto them. Laura turned towards them and finally a smile spread across her lips. She ran to them and shared in their joy, hugged them and kissed them on the head.